hiding under your bed, teeth ground sharp and eyes glowing red.
I don't have any explanation for this other than the fact that I was 8 and maybe imagined it. But that doesn't explain the 14-year-old neighbor babysitting me being equally scared because she saw the same thing, and the couple next door also mentioning seeing strange things. There were also rumors that the 3rd floor in the apartment complex we lived in caused people to see stuff, but nothing this extreme ever happened. This happened during the winter. No one went outside much, but my parents had to leave for work for long hours and often left me with a neighbor. She stayed in our apartment, and I usually spent time messing around on her phone in the kitchen. We were playing a game when we heard something outside. So, we both stared into the window and figured it was a pigeon. But not long after the noise, down came flying a leg. Not a boot or a shoe, but what looked to be a full-blown human limb falling off the 4th floor balcony. She just stared in bewilderment, and I was really confused as to what had just happened. Her first thought was that it must have been something else, so she looked down to check, but nothing was on the ground. I also looked down and almost fell out of the window, and really, nothing was there. She just ended up brushing it off as a boot that fell from the balcony. We continued doing whatever in the kitchen when there was a noise again, and this time, an arm fell from the balcony. Nothing was on the ground again, so the neighbor just dragged me back into her apartment and texted my mum that I'll be waiting there because something was happening. To this day, we're still confused about the whole thing. People from the 2nd floor said they didn't see anything, and people from the 4th floor denied anything falling from anybody's balcony. The only people who did see anything were people from our floor. This was just one of the many strange things that happened while my family still lived there, and I still kind of shudder when thinking back on it. I always chalked it up to maybe a fungus or a gas or something of the sort on our floor causing people to hallucinate. But surely we wouldn't all hallucinate the same things. This isn't a work of fiction intended to scare you. It is my account of a ghost that lived in my apartment. I have only told a few people this, and it is from 20 years ago when I was in college. I lived in student housing with 4 roommates in our pod. It was 5 bedrooms and shared kitchen and bathroom for those 5 bedrooms. The bedrooms were all in a row on one side of a long hallway. My room was on the end opposite the front door, and the kitchen was at the far end of the hall, and the bathrooms were opposite the bedrooms. On multiple occasions when leaving my room late at night, before I could turn my head, out of the corner of my eye there was a nurse standing at the far end of the hall facing me. Now, there is a nursing program at this college, so a nurse in student housing was a normal occurrence. This nurse, however, was dressed in a manner more appropriate to the 1940s or 50s. Definitely not 2000s scrubs that the current students wore. Now, more than a sight out of the corner of my eye, I would also feel a presence strong enough that I knew someone was there. The best similar feeling I could think of is when there is someone sitting directly behind you in a theater or on public transit. You can't see them, but you can feel their presence, and you know they are there. The second I turned my head, the feeling disappeared, and there was no nurse. There was nobody at all, just 4 locked bedrooms and an empty kitchen and bathrooms. Yes, I checked every room. Since it wasn't particularly exciting or scary, I dismissed it. I assumed it was because I was tired and it was late at night. I repeatedly saw the nurse on at least a monthly basis. 1 month, I saw her every week. Nothing I could do to see her better. If I resisted turning my head, the feeling would remain until I looked her way. That's all that ever happened. I never told anyone about the nurse because at this point, it was a pretty boring story. Plus, I didn't exactly believe in ghosts. So what was I actually going to tell them? That my mind played a trick on me when I was tired? That's not exactly news. During one of our parties, a classmate of mine asked who the nurse was. My roommates dismissed it because we had all been drinking. I asked him what he saw, and he said she was dressed old-timey and she disappeared fast. I told him there was no nurse here, and he said he knew someone was there, but since there was nowhere for the nurse to hide, he let it go. 2 years later, a friend from my hometown came to visit. Halfway through her visit, she asked why I didn't tell her about the nurse who lived here. I said because there is no nurse who lived here. She got a confused look on her face and said, "Then who was wearing the costume?" I said, "I don't know." To be very clear, I never told either friend I sometimes saw a nurse ghost in my apartment, and they don't know each other, so they couldn't have shared their story. I don't know what was actually going on in that apartment, but looking back on it now, I find it fun that it was actually a ghost. This is my first post here, so please be patient with me through my jumbled stories. I'll do my best to make everything as clear as possible. When I was 10 years old, my mother and I moved to this apartment complex in Claremore, Oklahoma, and we stayed there until I was about 12 years old. To start, I should let you know that my mum worked for the complex as a maintenance tech, so I will include some creepy stuff that she encountered that will also feed into the weirdness. My first encounter happened within the first week of moving in. This was my first time having my own room, so I was incredibly excited to decorate it with Minecraft souvenirs and Star Wars memorabilia. And by the time I finished decorating, I was as slumped as a 10-year-old could be, so I decided to hit the sheets in my brand new bed. My dog, Buddy, and I got comfortable in the new bed and went to sleep with a light-up star machine, basking in the ceiling with the galaxy and countless stars. Now keep in mind how I said Buddy was in bed with me. I quickly fell asleep, which is super unusual because I suffer from insomnia. To my surprise, I woke up sometime before 4 a.m. I didn't wake up feeling well rested and ready for a day full of Legos and fruit snacks. I woke up feeling groggy and confused, but that wasn't the weird part of this. My dog Buddy was standing outside my open bedroom door, growling and staring into my lit-up bedroom, and that scared the heck out of me, because Buddy wasn't a vocal pup and had never growled, barked, or made any sounds due to him being a service doggo. I sat there calling to him, trying to get him to come back into my room, but he wouldn't budge. So I got out of my bed and walked out of my room to see what was wrong with him. As soon as I cleared the door, he stopped making sounds and sat there looking up at me with these concerned eyes, trying to tell me something that I wish I could understand. So I walked down the dark hallway to see if my mum was still up and watching TV, but to no surprise, the house was still and she was sleeping in her room. This entire time, Buddy was closely following me, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, other than being really spooked. So I turned back to go to my room. When we reached my room, I walked in, and Buddy stood at the door and stared at me, not wanting to go any further. So I once again called to him, which soon turned into commands, telling him to come, but this guy wouldn't go any further. Standing there, staring at me with worried eyes. I was undoubtedly scared, so being a wee lad, I closed my door to protect me from any would-be danger, and got back into bed and eventually fell asleep. But he never went into that room again. He slept right outside the door from that point on. Okay, so if this story doesn't convince you that some creepy stuff was happening, the next one will. So I've lived in Chicago for 6 years now, and my first apartment here was definitely haunted. I've been a firm believer in the paranormal for years, ever since I was a kid, and found books in my local library about ghosts in the non-fiction section, which of course, I believed it to be common real knowledge back then. I always wondered what it would be like to live in an actual haunted house. Well, I now know. When my roommate and I first moved into this apartment, we were blown away by how cheap the rent was and how large and accommodating the unit was. The owner of the apartment was a little old lady who we'll call Janet, who couldn't realistically live there anymore because it was a 3-story walk-up unit and her old age was starting to get to her. She had saved up enough to get a retirement condo by the lake, but didn't want to give up her old apartment entirely, so she decided to rent it out. Nothing crazy happened at first. It was slowly over time that my roommate and I started to notice more and more bizarre things. Like most experiences people have in similar situations, it started out as unexplainable bumps and thuds. This was an older building that had radiator heating, so most of the noises you could attribute to that. But sometimes, things would happen. You would hear what sounded like footsteps walking down the hallway, only for no one to appear when they should have. The sound of someone scratching something seemed to occur around you at random times. There was once I was in my room, probably browsing Reddit, and I heard a scratching sound coming from directly underneath a discarded plastic bag near my wastebasket. We've had mice get into the apartment before and die, so I figured it was a mouse or something. When I threw a pen next to the bag to spook whatever it was from underneath, the scratching continued to happen uninterrupted. When I finally stood up and picked the bag up, there was absolutely nothing underneath. The scratching bag never made a noise again. Sometimes when you were lying down trying to sleep, there was a sudden feeling that someone had just entered the room, even with the door closed. Hard to explain, but it was just a different type of energy. I would also feel the same energy dissipate, as if whatever it was that came in left. My roommate once claimed to actually see a pair of floating eyes as he walked down the hallway late one night. Also, while he was sick once, he swore he saw a woman standing in the kitchen from down the hallway. When he looked again, she was gone. 2 of the most insane occurrences there had witnesses. Otherwise, I would feel like I would be doubting my own sanity. One was when a friend of mine who was visiting and I were sitting on my couch in the living room. I had just finished a cup of yogurt and put it down with the spoon still resting in it. It sat undisturbed for a couple of minutes, and then we both saw it completely do a 360 spin on its axis. It's as if it tilted itself back and then spun, and then sat right back down. My friend and I sat speechless for a second before he said, Did you just see that?" The other instance was when the same friend was staying over on an inflatable mattress in our dining room. For context, our apartment was basically the shape of a dumbbell. You entered into the living room, and then to your right was the hallway. There was my roommate's room on your first left, the bathroom door, which also had a connecting door to my roommate's room, on your next left, and then finally, my room, on your final left. The hallway opened up into a small dining room which fed directly into the kitchen. This night in particular, we had been drinking and smoking and what have you. We went to bed, and a massive thunderstorm passed through. The sound of thunder woke me up at around 3:30 a.m. That, and the sound of my roommate puking in the bathroom. He had had some bad egg rolls apparently. As I'm laying there listening to the sound of him vomiting in the thunderstorm, I hear my friend, who was in the dining room, get up, walk down the hallway, and stop directly in front of the bathroom door. I thought to myself, that's weird that he's getting up to check on John. He knew John in college. He should know he can take care of himself. But there was no knock on the bathroom door. No anything. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. When the morning came, I sat in the living room with my roommate and mentioned how our guest had gotten up to check on him. I heard him too, my roommate said. I wondered why he was just standing outside the bathroom door. Our friend eventually woke up and joined us. But when we asked him why he did that, he just stared at us and said, I heard that too, but I thought that was you getting up to check on John. From his perspective, I can see how he thought it was someone else because the steps were walking away from where he was in the dining room. After I thought about it some more, I realized I never heard any more footsteps after those initial ones. And if it had been my friend, I would have heard him go back to his air mattress. That's the one that has never left my mind. All three of us heard the same thing. We like to think it was just checking on my sick roommate. All in all, to answer my own question of what it would be like to live in a haunted house, the answer is you just go to bed and pretend it isn't happening. As promised, this will be the rest of my encounters and such. For anyone that isn't caught up, these are encounters that I had when I lived in an apartment complex when I was 10 to 12 years old. If you listen to the first story, then you should have an idea of what kind of creepy stuff went on from the start. But to continue this experience, I'm going to tell you about a really weird neighbor that lived above my apartment. I had first met this lady when I was sitting outside on my porch with a couple of pals that I had met in the complex. She had walked downstairs and introduced herself, a name that I couldn't even bother to remember, but for the sake of this story, we'll call her Karen. She said that she lives upstairs and that she also has a boy, and we should hang out sometimes because he's super shy and never likes to come outside. Which was weird because I had seen her a few times before, leaving her apartment, and she never had a boy with her. But to be kind, I politely accepted the offer to meet her son, and she said she would set up something for us. Karen turned around and went back upstairs to her apartment. So as time went on, my mum and I would hear really strange things coming from her apartment through the ceiling, like crying, things falling, and constant stomping. No joke, 2 to 4 in the morning, repetitive stomping. But one night, it really topped the cake. My mum and I were sitting in the living room playing my PlayStation 2, when there was this incredibly loud bang and a thud upstairs, and then we heard what sounded like screaming and crying. At this point, I was shaking and looked to my mum for some kind of answer, but the look on her face showed glimpses of fear and confusion. But this didn't make me feel any better because my mum is a hard sumbitch. My mum decided to call the police for a welfare check on our neighbor and explained everything that we had heard. So, some 15 minutes later, the police show up and we watch them walk upstairs to her place. We're listening closely to see what's happening, and so they knock a few times, but there's no answer. After a couple of minutes of them knocking, Karen finally answers the door and sounds like she's drunk because she's slurring her words, and the officers are asking her if she's okay and if she needs to sit down or if they need to call her a paramedic. Over the next few minutes they talk to her and pretty much get nowhere, and she's not letting them into her apartment, so they have to just wrap it up and leave. the rest of the night, we sit inside wondering what happened up there. A few days later, my mum suggests to go upstairs to see if her son might want to come and hang out and play some games. I really didn't want to because of all the creepy things that we had heard from up there, but let's just put it like this, I didn't have much of a choice. So I go ahead and walk my ass up there and knock on her door, and I kid you not, she opens the door within 10 seconds of me knocking. I shrug it off and introduce myself again, and she reminds me that she knows who I am with a friendly smile, and asks what she can do for me. I ask if her son is home, and if he can come hang out with me downstairs and play some games. Now, I get to catch a few looks inside her crib, and it was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. The place was spotless and barely had any furniture. It just shook me the wrong way, if you know what I mean. So this is where things get weird. The lady sits there and says she doesn't have a son. I'm kinda confused, so I get quiet for a second, but then try to remind her of the day we met and how she invited me to come meet her son. At this point, her face turns sour and she looks angry. She says I'm confused and that she doesn't have any kids and says that I need to leave or she'll call the cops or something like that. So I just walk away because I'm already weirded out. I go downstairs and tell my mum what happened, and she chops it up to the lady being mentally disabled. So about 2 months later, the lady gets up and just leaves. All her stuff was still there, and everything. So as I previously stated in the first story, my mum was a maintenance tech for the apartment complex. So she would go into the recently empty apartments to fix holes, paint, replace broken appliances, etc. So when she went up to Karen's place, she let me go with her so I could help and get out of the house and such. When I went up there with her, I got to look around and see everything just the way she left it. Going through the apartment, we noticed a few things that made no sense. Like absolutely no pictures or any personal belongings that would tell you who lived there. All of her clothes were still there. And to top it all off, the second bedroom was decorated for a young boy, and that's including a closet with clothes. This apartment was empty until my sister moved into it a few months later. So the next few things that happened can't be explained. Over these next few months, my mum and I would hear stomping, running, thuds and bangs all coming from upstairs. The leasing manager and my mum called the police multiple times because they thought people were squatting upstairs, but every time they found nothing, and it came to the point where they padlocked the door for extra insurance, but the sounds never stopped. The next story is a quick one, but is still spooky. One day my mum was home cooking and doing her thing, while I was out with my pals, running around and being a hood rat. My mum had called me and was pissed because apparently I had run inside and slammed the doors on my way out. At this point, I'm like in the woods with my pals, super confused, telling her that I haven't been home since I left, so it couldn't have been me. She then told me she was in the bathroom and heard the front door open and then a bedroom door open, and when she called for me, she got no response back, and then heard the front door slam really loud. So she got up and ran into the living room thinking it was me, and probably ready to bust my ass for slamming doors. But I reassured her that I was not anywhere near the house, and hadn't been for a few hours. Nothing really happened after this, but it for sure spooked the both of us for the minute. Now let's get to the most terrifying thing to happen out of the entire time I lived there. This is about my next door neighbor. This lady was really kind from the moment I met her until the moment she moved out, but she was into some weird stuff. Let me catch you up on some of the things we noticed from her. She was a really heavy drinker, and countless times she would drink so much that she would pass out in her place with her door wide open and all her stuff there for anybody to snatch. This one morning, I walked out of my front door because I heard music, and her door was wide open with wine glasses sitting on her porch chair, her phone right next to it. I would tell my mum she would go and take all of her stuff and set it inside her place, then close the door and lock it with the extra master key. Now, like I mentioned before, she was incredibly kind, and multiple times she would let me come into her apartment and pick a few movies from her vast collection to borrow. She even made me some brownies for my birthday one year. But with that being said, there was some shady stuff about her. Like, she was into all the dark, creepy witchcraft type stuff. And she and her apartment reflected that 100%. She had painted her walls black and had all the gothic decorations you could wish for. Now, I'm noting that because it applies to the story. This isn't just me being a judgmental prick. Now that you know her, we can get into the spooky stuff. One night, my mum and I were in her room, watching a movie, and it was pretty late, probably about 12 to 3 a.m. But the neighbor had music playing really loud in her apartment. That never bothered us because we didn't share walls with her, so we usually just ignored it. But on this night, it was really loud, and we just cut that up to her just being really drunk. So we're just chilling, watching our movie when, out of nowhere, we hear a scream that would make the angel of death jump in his skin. And followed by that scream was her running out her apartment, butt-ass naked, screaming and begging somebody to help her because something was trying to kill her and take her soul. My mum and I are already at our door when she runs outside and takes off through the hallway, leading to the stairs heading down to the street. My mum takes off after her to see if she's okay, and I'm just standing there terrified and wondering what had just happened. When my mum gets back to the apartment, she has the lady by the arm and takes her inside our apartment and into the bathroom until the cops got there. They eventually took her to a hospital because they thought she was having a psychotic break. My mum then explains to me that the lady said that she was sleeping in her bed when she was woken up to a dark demon in the corner of her bedroom, screaming at her and telling her that he will take her soul. When my mum caught her, she was shaking like a leaf and crying frantically, begging my mum to help her because she didn't want to die. She moved not long after this. But wait, there's more. When my mum cleaned up her apartment, she had to repaint the entire place because it was all black. But that's not unusual. When it came to painting the second bedroom, my mum noticed the ceiling was peeling really bad, so she had to scrape off this old paint to reapply new paint. But when she was peeling off the paint, she found dried red splatters all over the ceiling. So of course she had to tell the boss, and they called the police. The police took samples and eventually got back to the manager and said it was animal blood. Now, this all clicked for us because our neighbor had gotten new kittens multiple times but seemed to never keep them for very long. But you can decide what to think about that information. Now, this is really all of the major stories I have, but I can tell you that it didn't end there. I slept in my room for about a year of living there, but after that I slept on a pallet in my mum's bedroom until we moved, mainly because my dog would never sleep in there, and I would constantly wake up to loud thuds on my walls and would hear weird sounds during the day. One of my mum's co-workers moved into a different apartment because she claimed that she was experiencing scary stuff too. We had also heard that this complex was built on an ancient Native American burial site, but I've never fact-checked that, so take it with a grain of salt.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.